Good morning, friends. Welcome to Wake Up in the Word. Hey, thanks for joining me and Merry Christmas. It is Christmas Eve 2024, and we're going to conclude our series of Christmas devotionals today with the visit of the wise men. So join me over in the second chapter of Matthew's Gospel. Now, before you get there, I want to encourage you to perhaps attend a Christmas Eve service somewhere near you. You might want to attend if you're around Polk County, North Carolina. There are several churches having Christmas Eve services, including our home church, Midway Baptist. And then you might be somewhere near Hendersonville, North Carolina, where you could come to our Christmas Eve service at Mud Creek Baptist Church at 5 p.m. There are some churches like First Baptist Spartanburg here in South Carolina that are having many Christmas Eve services. They're having one at 3:30 in the afternoon and then another one at 5. So, hey, just check online and check your local options and consider putting worship at the head of your Christmas list as you finish up Christmas 2024. Well, as we go to the second chapter of Matthew, we're going to read a familiar story and perhaps bring some information in that you've never heard before. We always see, especially in nativity scenes, three characters showing up, often dressed in strange costumes, sometimes on camels, that we call the wise men. And we see from this passage that they showed up not exactly when Jesus was born, but sometime later. And we'll demonstrate that shortly. Who are these guys, and what does this visit mean? Now, listen, I can't touch on all of this in a 10-minute devotional, but we'll see how far we can get before we wrap this up, okay? In verse 1, it says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of King Herod, wise men from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star at its rising and have come to worship him. Well, when King Herod heard this, he was deeply disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. So he assembled all the chief priests and scribes of the people and asked them where the Messiah would be born. Isn't it interesting that Herod did not know? Well, in verse 5, they replied, in Bethlehem of Judea, because this is what was written by the prophet. They go back and quote Micah in verse 6, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, because out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. In verse 7, then Herod secretly summoned the wise men and asked them the exact time the star appeared. Because you see, this star and the leading of the star took place over a time period, something they saw happening in the sky that has given them time to decide to come to Jerusalem, make the trip, and now arrive. So obviously, no jet planes, no automobiles, no rapid means of transportation in those days. Had to be a little bit of a time lag here. Well, they tell him the story. And of course, in verse 8, it says, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, now go and search carefully for the child. When you find him, report back to me so that I too can go and worship him. Yeah, what a lie. Well, in verse number 9, it says, after hearing the king, they went on their way, and there it was, the star they had seen at its rising. So this is something they have seen, they continue to see, and they're watching its movements. Now, we know stars don't typically move in such drastic fashion. Planets, however, do. That's why in much of the study that relates to what this star was doing, we recognize that those that had been identified, in this case, we believe Jupiter, as representing certain things, the king star, for example, that its movements would have been considered by these Magi, these wise men, as directing them to the place where Jesus had been born. So it says, when they saw the star, here's what happened. There it was, the star they had seen its rising. It led them until it came and stopped above the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overwhelmed with joy. Now that means basically that since we've arrived in a time of the explosion of knowledge predicted by Daniel in the Old Testament, that we actually have the technology that we can take the sky and roll it back to any date in history and see what it looked like from any place on the planet, even outside this planet. And by doing so, we can identify when this star did, in its movements, its retrograde motion, look as if it moved right over Bethlehem from Jerusalem and stopped. So there's no doubt really as to when this happened. I'll even give you the dates by the end of this devotional. So it says, when they saw the star, they were overwhelmed with joy, and entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. And so, hang on, here's what we know from this encounter. This is not at the birth where Jesus has been born. He's not in one of the caves or the grottos or the basement of the house where the animals were kept. No, this is sometime later. Matter of fact, it's so much later that Jesus was, as described here, a child. He was more like a toddler. He was growing up. He had been born and now was living with his parents in Bethlehem. They decided not to move back to Nazareth yet. And so here we are with a time period having passed since the birth, so that Jesus is being recognized and worshiped perhaps about a year and 3 or 4 months later. We'll give you the dates in just a minute. Matter of fact, when they came, they responded in a strange way. Keep in mind, we would consider these wise men, these Magi, Gentiles. They were not Jews. Or were they? Had they been somehow converted? Were they proselytes that were a part of the descendants of the Jews who had been in captivity in Babylon and Persia? Well, we don't actually know, but we know the class of people referred to as the Magi had been leading in priestly fashion for generations in Persia, and they existed for a long time after that. Many folks in those regions say they can trace their lineage to them even to this day. We know that they were influenced by Daniel, the prophet, and many of the other Jews that were there. Did you know most Jews did not come back after the dispersion? When Jerusalem was rebuilt, most actually stayed in Babylon and Persia. Many intermarried with some of the folks there and obviously passed along their teachings. And the teachings of Daniel in particular point to a time period in which the Messiah would be born. It's described in Daniel chapter 9. So because of this, they arrive and watch what they do. It says, falling to their knees, they worshiped him. Wow, could we be looking at the first Gentile converts? Here are the first worshipers of Jesus that are not from the Jewish heritage of, say, the shepherds that showed up when Jesus was born. And it says they worshiped him. They opened their treasures, presenting him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Those gifts alone demonstrated something of his kingship, and the myrrh, a strange gift, even foreshadowed his death. These gifts were presented and timely because they were probably quite valuable, allowing the Holy Family to be able to make a trip that was in their future that they had not expected. Now watch this. These gifts had been presented. These Gentiles are worshiping in the presence of Jesus, the child Jesus. And then it says in verse 12, being warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their own country by another route. And after they were gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, get up, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt and stay there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and escaped to Egypt. He stayed there until Herod's death, so that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son. Now, what did Herod do as far as reaction? I'm not going to read all of it for you for the sake of time, but in the next few verses, starting in verse 16, we see something called, in some versions, the massacre of the innocents, or the slaughter of the innocents. His response to go kill all the baby boys that were aged 2 and younger. So it shows you that he was concerned about that time frame from whence the Magi had referred to seeing the star in the beginning. A terrible reaction, and it shows just how evil humanity can be in rebellion to God, why we need a Savior in the first place. So when did these things happen? Well, for years we've depended on some error-filled information, historically inaccurate, that placed the birth of Jesus some as early as 4 or 5 BC. Did not happen. And the reason all that was messed up is just because of an error in some copied versions of the history of Josephus that placed Herod's death at the wrong time. Now, I won't go into all the details of what caused all of that, but I will tell you this for certain. Jesus was born probably in the month of September in the year 3 BC. He was born during the fall feasts. Isn't that interesting? Go back and check out the meaning of some of those. And wow, especially the Day of Atonement and Yom Kippur and Feast of Tabernacles, all that. This was the time frame in which Jesus was born. And guess what? The visit of the Magi, we know for certain, because we can see what the sky was doing at that time, was on, hang on, hold your hats, December the 25th in the year 2 BC. That's right. Jesus may not have been born on December 25th, but that's when the wise men showed up to worship him. Because of a lunar eclipse that happened January the 10th, 1 BC, we know Herod died shortly after that eclipse and before Passover of that same year, about 12 weeks difference there, confirming the fact that this is the time, this is the year in which Jesus was born. Wow, the implications of this are powerful, but the most important one is this. People from far away knew, because God had set it up, even in his scope of creation, that the Messiah would come. He would come not just for the Jews, he would come for the Gentiles as well. Aren't you glad? And therefore the gospel goes forth that the birth and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ are all a part of God's great plan to build his family for all eternity. I trust you're a part of that so that you can have the very best Christmas ever, even as we celebrate it in 2024. Hey, God bless you. We'll see you after Christmas. We're going to take a little bit of a break, spend some time with family, and we'll see you after good ways after Christmas and in the new year as we wake up in God's Word.